Okay, so you kind of grew up in a liberal environment, but it wasn't that classical sort of Australian upper class liberal. It was a pretty middle class liberal, the true liberal.
I'm sure we'll talk about this more during this interview. But I mean, the real people that the Liberal Party were meant to be representing were the middle class, and I think I came from a very middle class family, a family that originally was blue collar, very much, and I'm fascinated by family tree research. I've done all the work on the tree on top of what my mum did, and I can tell you now the original Newman was the cook on a Dutch ship. He was a German who was on a Dutch ship who came into Sydney in 1854.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing what you can find out there now. Look, the topic of tonight's interview that we want to focus on is the future of conservative, which you don't identify as, liberal, classical liberal, and libertarian style politics in Australia. They're, I think, the three political definitions of the groups that don't feel totally represented by the modern Liberal Party. Before we get on to that, you resigned from the Liberal Party in 2021. Why? What was the reason and the final trigger?
Well, at the time, of course, we were in the second year of COVID, and I was just dismayed by what I saw coming from the federal coalition government, and indeed from state Liberal Party and LNP teams around the nation, who, well, in the case of the Morrison government, they were people who had imposed draconian lockdown laws in cahoots with the states, had engaged in vaccine coercion, who had made Australians prisoners in their own country, who had stopped Australians coming back from overseas, who had intervened in the economy in areas, and I'm involved in commercial property, and intervened in the commercial property market to actually, break essentially the legal contracts between tenant and landlord. There were a whole range of things. Then, if I turn to the state opposition,
people will say it was a serious time. It was a crisis.
Well, I say
so. It justifies all of these.
Well, I say it doesn't justify it. And people like myself from late 2020 were on, stations like Sky News saying what they were doing was overreach, was wrong. I agree that at the very beginning of COVID, people didn't know what they were dealing with, but by the time we got to the end of 2020, it was quite clear that there was already an overreaction. And by the end of 2020, it was quite clear that Sweden had taken, if you like, a principled stance to do this differently from the rest of the world, which has now been shown to have been incredibly effective, more effective than Australia's approach.
And Florida too,
and Florida,
and the results have been very good
frankly,
there.
I do feel that that the Morrison government stuffed it up completely and took the Liberal Party in places that Menzies would never have, sanctioned, and so that's why I left. But essentially, it was, restriction on our freedoms and liberty, intervention in the private sector, in all sorts of ways. Not standing up for the values of the party, and we can talk about that. So that was at the federal level, and then we had state oppositions and administrations who were doing the same sort of stuff. What about those terrible scenes in Victoria where the police, time and time again, were involved in overreach?
Well, military-style trucks.
Quite violent overreach.
Never saw that in Queensland under Joe.
Well, we never saw exactly. No. Well, but we saw Morrison as a cheerleader for that. We saw Greg Hunt and Morrison do a deal with a pharmaceutical company without proper scrutiny, and that pharmaceutical company at the time. And I'm talking about Pfizer, of course, and it's a matter of the public record, had been hit with the largest corporate fine by the US regulators in US history, and yet they just we just trusted them, did a deal with them. And look, that was just too much to handle.